As a journalist, of all the things you're asked to cover, few are as dull as the press conference. Hot, airless rooms, complicated systems about who asks questions, and the revelatory story you're often promised, rarely revelatory. But every so often, you get lucky. So you're sitting there.
Yes.
Just set the scene then, set the scene of the room, like how many journalists and what did it look like and who was on the stage?
I was quite surprised at how many people were there. I'm in this room, there's 100 journalists. I don't recognise a lot of them. Normally, you turn up, no one else is there, because a lot of people are holding press conferences all the time. He was like a leader in waiting or something. I just remember thinking, there's a lot of people backing this guy.
We're picking up our story on the 5th of March, 2002. 3 years since the apartment bombs that killed some 300 people. 2 since Vladimir Putin became president. And apart from a few journalists and politicians in Russia still investigating the attacks, the world's mostly moved on. But today, thousands of miles from Moscow in London, there's a press conference about the bombs. And journalists at the BBC's Newsnight programme, one of Britain's most prominent TV news shows, have sent their presenter to cover it. BBC journalist Jeremy Vine.
It was just, can you go and attend this press conference? And, is your microphone working? So I went with a working microphone and a camera operator.
Jeremy's now a seasoned broadcaster with his own BBC radio show. But back then, he was just starting out.
I was amazed looking back at this tape because I'm such a square and I look so posh and I've got this side parting and I've got no grey hair. And at the time, I was on Newsnight. I was a really keen bunny.
And at this press conference, journalists had been told to expect something big, a fresh twist about the apartment bombs. And when you got there, did you know what he was going to say?
So we were there for some red meat. We were thinking we were going to learn something quite important. Someone had definitely said, this guy is telling maybe not the truth, but a truth that you need to hear.
The man on stage leading this press conference has been preparing the ground for weeks. He's told the New York Times that he has important evidence about who'd bombed the apartments. Proof, he said, that is no less than the evidence the United States had that Osama bin Laden was responsible for the World Trade Center attacks. The question now, would anyone believe him? I'm Helena Merriman, and this is the History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs. Episode 4, The Poisoning. The man holding this press conference, we've not met him in our story so far, but he's always been there, in the shadows. His name? Boris Berezovsky. Boris Berezovsky was one of the first Russian oligarchs, this group of business tycoons who became rich overnight in the 90s. He was charismatic, confident.
He had that swagger of the self-made man.
Like all the oligarchs, Berezovsky was ambitious and astonishingly wealthy. But he had something that gave him the edge. He became the main shareholder in Channel 1, Russia's most-watched TV channel, which became Berezovsky's personal propaganda machine. So Berezovsky didn't just have money, he had influence. As a Russian journalist put it, to Berezovsky, Russia was a chessboard, but one on which only he moved the pieces. And in 1999, Berezovsky made his biggest move yet. He used his money and power to help propel Vladimir Putin to the presidency. Berezovsky now saw himself as the Russian kingmaker. But his new king was about to turn against him. Shortly after Putin became president, Putin went after Berezovsky, wrestling Channel 1 out of his hands. And Berezovsky, he was furious.
Boris Berezovsky had backed Mr. Putin during his election campaign, but he's now expected to become one of the president's fiercest critics.
He declared war on Vladimir Putin.
He helped to make Vladimir Putin, but now he says he's gone too far.
Why am I taking this step? I don't want to take part in the destruction of Russia. That's what's going on. I'm convinced of that.
The two men, once friends, were now enemies, locked into a bitter feud. Soon there was an arrest warrant for Berezovsky on charges of fraud. It was clear. This was a fight Berezovsky couldn't win, and he fled Russia for London. The Russian kingmaker, now an exile.
It's all a long way from the Yeltsin era, when Berezovsky was a Kremlin insider and a kingmaker for Vladimir Putin. Now his creature has outgrown him.
And now, 2 years later, in March 2002, still burning with rage, Boris Berezovsky has called this press conference in London, where he's about to share what he says will be a shocking revelation. Berezovsky begins the press conference by playing a film about the apartment bombs. It explores all the unresolved questions, like that unexploded bomb in Ryazan that the FSB says was a training exercise. Then it's time for Berezovsky's announcement. Watching in the audience, the BBC's Jeremy Vine.
The accusation he made was that the FSB had carried out the apartment bombings in order to give Putin credit for tackling Chechnya, which would then lead him to the presidency.
This wasn't a new theory. Russian journalists and opposition figures had said it for years. But now it's Boris Berezovsky saying it, the former Kremlin kingmaker, the man who'd helped install Putin in the first place. And here he is saying that the apartment bombs were an inside job. When you heard that idea, what was your immediate reaction?
I remember thinking, this looks like a guy with an agenda. He's a rich bloke. He's fallen out with Putin. He wants to give him, in football you'd call it an X-rated sliding tackle, sort of give him some shin pain. And it seemed to me like this was essentially him taking a little bit of vengeance or a sideswipe at Putin.
And so when it's time for questions, Jeremy Vine puts this to Berezovsky.
Do you concede that you will be seen to have a political motive here, which is, in saying all this, to unseat the man who shut down your TV station?
And Boris Berezovsky replies,
anyone is able to think about my motivation, everything he wants, you understand? You see, I don't want to discuss about this point. I just present evidence, which, from my point of view, are very important for Russia.
It's a defensive reply from a man who hates Putin. And so this bombshell announcement about the bombs? Well, none of the journalists in the room seem to believe it.
The chances of this press conference being seen on TV in Russia, where Mr. Berezovsky is now a wanted man, are, one presumes, remote or slight. The evidence that we've just heard in this room was sketchy. The story disturbing. The man at the centre of it, an enigma.
That night,
we're joined now by Mr. Berezovsky in the studio to talk a bit more about these allegations.
Newsnight brings Boris Berezovsky into the BBC studio for a live interview.
All your evidence seems to point to a bomb that didn't explode, but you don't have evidence on the incidents where the bombs tragically did.
No, I have, because the same mechanism was used in Moscow, absolutely the same. The same explosive, hexagen, the same detonator, the same technology. But in Moscow, the houses were exploded. In Ryazan, it was stopped by a person who suddenly watched what happened there.
Now, but while these bombs were going off, where were you? You were actually at Mr. Putin's side. You were his ally. You were his friend.
Absolutely correct. I supported Putin during his election campaign. And after 1 year, I cut my relations with Putin.
You cut your relations because you fell out over your TV station.
Absolutely correct. But my motivation here is very simple. The people of Russia had the biggest terroristic attack for the history of Russia. And no one today from official explained what happened. Just one version, that it was done by Chechens. This version does not work. My understanding is that it was organized by FSB people, and I presented
that's FSB,
facts.
and that's the Internal Secret Services of Russia.
Correct.
Okay, so in a short answer, do you believe Mr. Putin knew or authorized these attacks, in your opinion?
At least knew.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Berezovsky.
And that's it. Boris Berezovsky leaves the studio. And the story? It sinks. This was the most high-profile accusation yet, that the 1999 apartment bombs were somehow linked to the Russian state. Berezovsky hoped his intervention would spark new investigations, maybe even real consequences. Instead, it did the opposite. It discredited the theory. Overnight, the inside job idea became tied to Berezovsky, and anything Berezovsky said about Putin looked like score settling, hard to take seriously. And this, perhaps, is where the tale of the apartment bombs might have ended. But there was something, or rather someone, at that press conference that Jeremy Vine didn't notice. Were you aware of a man called Alexander Litvinenko in the room?
No, I wasn't. Was he in the audience?
Yes.
Okay. That's amazing. God, that's incredible. So I mean, obviously in hindsight, you just think, wow, if you could see what was going to happen.
Alexander Litvinenko, a name most people in Britain know, because a few years after that press conference, he'll be poisoned on the streets of London, dying slowly in the glare of the media spotlight. But what most people don't know, even now, was that Litvinenko had spent the last years of his life investigating one particular story. This one, the apartment bombs. So why don't we actually go back to 2006?
Mm-hmm. So the timeline, I was kind of going back as much as I could over it, although it's hard.
This is journalist Gordon Corera. He used to work at the BBC, covering national security. And in 2006, 4 years after Berezovsky's press conference, Gordon was about to land in the middle of a story that would change how the West thought about the Russian state and what it was capable of. It all begins on a cold autumn day in November 2006.
I remember a colleague of mine coming up to me and saying that some of his contacts had told him about this really odd story that a former Russian spy or security officer was ill and was claiming he'd been poisoned. And he said to me, you might want to look into this.
So Gordon makes a few calls.
But I'll be honest, initially, it just seemed too fanciful, this idea that someone could have been poisoned in London. And, the news desk was asking, everyone was kind of asking, well, what do we know? And there were no answers.
No answers, because it just sounded too implausible. It's the kind of thing that happened in the dark days of the Cold War, with KGB assassins wielding poisoned umbrellas, not in the 21st century. And at that point you find out his name, Alexander Litvinenko. Back then, not a familiar name. So Gordon starts digging. Discovers Litvinenko had been in the FSB since the 90s, part of a special unit investigating crime in Russia. And one of his first jobs was to monitor Boris Berezovsky.
And also to report back on him.
At least, that's how it starts. But a few years later, Litvinenko's orders change.
Litvinenko is asked by superior to kill Boris Berezovsky.
Why?
There were factions who hated Berezovsky. He was a schemer and a manipulator himself, and had become very rich, and so he certainly had lots of enemies.
So what does he do? He's asked to kill him?
So Litvinenko actually decides, partly because he's got to know Berezovsky over the years, that instead he's going to tell him.
But that's not all. Litvinenko wants to go further, wants to tell people higher up the FSB chain about the corruption he's seen. So he goes to see the man who's just become the new director of the FSB.
And the new man is Vladimir Putin. And Litvinenko goes to see Putin with this dossier of evidence. And he's saying to Putin, look, here are the corrupt people. You can clear house. You can do something about it. And when Litvinenko offers him the dossier, Putin says, no, you keep it. I don't want it. And I think at that point, Litvinenko must realise that Putin may not be the man to clear house.
The meeting lasts 10 minutes. Litvinenko leaves with a target on his back.
And so Litvinenko, he realises his time is up.
You'd think at this point that Litvinenko might disappear into the shadows. But he does the opposite. he comes out into the light.
He goes public, extraordinarily reckless, really.
In November 1998, Alexander Litvinenko and 4 other FSB officers organise a press conference. In the footage, you see Litvinenko in a brown suit and shirt, reading from a statement describing the corruption within the FSB.
And what's even more amazing is other FSB officers are in masks because they know the
Hiding
risks.
their face.
Hiding their face because they know the risks for them. He is there, no mask to be seen. He's made the choice to be the public face, alleging deep corruption within the Russian security services.
And that choice changes Litvinenko's life.
He's put in prison. 8 months he's in prison in Moscow, including when the bombings happen.
Then, after he's released,
He is charged again.
and each time the charges change.
Because they're just looking for something to get him on. He's also getting death threats. So he knows his life is in danger. And so he realises he's got to get out.
It takes months of secret planning. But eventually, in November 2000, a year after the apartment bombs, Alexander Litvinenko and his family make it to Heathrow Airport in Britain.
And he finds the first police officer he can see and just walks up to them and says, "I am a KGB officer and I want asylum." And that is the start of his time in the UK.
So now Litvinenko has to make a new life for himself. And for that, he needs money. And that's where his old friend comes in.
He's supported by Boris Berezovsky. So Berezovsky funds him and helps with a house, helps with a regular supply of money.
And what does he get in return?
Berezovsky is basically plotting against Putin and collecting around him Putin critics. Whether it's Chechen leaders in exile, intellectuals, or former Russian security officers like Alexander Litvinenko. Berezovsky is collecting them, funding them, using them to support his campaign to undermine Putin.
And one of the things Berezovsky funds is an investigation into the apartment bombs. And the man who carries it out? Alexander Litvinenko. Now, Litvinenko was no longer in the FSB at the time of the apartment bombs. As you just heard, he was in prison at the time of the attacks. So he's starting this investigation from scratch, along with Russian historian Yuri Felchtinsky.
They interview people, they go around and try and find other people who've been in the FSB and who might be in exile in various parts of Europe, who might be able to provide information.
Litvinenko and Felchtinsky spread their net wide. They interview victims whose relatives died in the bombings. They track down one of the government's main suspects hiding in Georgia, who they believe was set up. They comb through newspapers and government reports. And it's there that Litvinenko stumbles across something odd. He finds a transcript of a session from the Duma, the Russian parliament. It's from the morning of September the 13th, 1999, the time of the apartment bombs. And I'm going to read you some of this transcript because of all the things that have come to light since the apartment bombs, this is possibly the wildest of them all. The Speaker of the Russian Parliament takes to the floor and says, "Esteemed colleagues, today in Russia is a day of mourning. Let us start our meeting and stand in memory of all the people killed in Dagestan and Moscow." He's referring to the first 2 apartment bombs. There's a minute's silence, and then the Speaker is handed a note. There's a pause as he gathers himself, taking in its contents, and then he reads it aloud to everyone there. It is reported, he says, that tonight an apartment was bombed in the town of Volgodonsk. It's the 3rd apartment bomb. But here's the thing. The apartment bombed that night wasn't in Volgodonsk. It was in Moscow. An innocent mistake, perhaps, so no one says anything at the time. But then, 3 days later...
Volgodonsk in southern Russia hasn't experienced anything like it since the Second World War.
The 4th apartment is blown up. Where? In Volgodonsk.
A massive explosion that ripped the face from this 9-story block of flats as its occupants lay asleep in their beds. Someone somewhere in Russia is doing this, but no one knows who or why.
Now, mistaking the name of a city where a bomb explodes is one thing. But for that city to be the very place where an apartment is bombed 3 days later in the largest country in the world, well, could that really just be a coincidence? And a few days later, someone spots this. A member of parliament takes to the floor to ask a question about it. But soon after he begins speaking, his microphone is cut off. Litvinenko makes a copy of the transcript and writes up all the details of his investigation, along with Yuri Felchtinsky. And in the summer of 2001, their book is published. It's called The FSB Blows Up Russia, and that, in a nutshell, is their conclusion. That the FSB bombed those Russian apartments. After the book comes out, a Russian newspaper prints a few chapters, but that's about it. There's very little coverage of the book by any Western journalists. In London, Boris Berezovsky promotes it, but that backfires.
One of the problems was that Berezovsky was known to be such a kind of schemer that it didn't necessarily add to the credibility the fact that he had backed the book and was promoting it. I think if it had been written more independently, it might have had more weight and more impact. But I think it was seen at the time as part of the battle between these two big figures, Berezovsky and Putin. And the book was a kind of tool that Berezovsky was using, or a weapon, against Putin. I think that may have led people not to take it as seriously as they might have done, or as they might do now.
But there's one place that does take an interest in the book. The FSB. This organisation that Litvinenko was part of, that now he's trying to bring down. And there, Litvinenko is so hated that when special forces are doing target practice, to give them extra motivation, they shoot at photos of Litvinenko's face.
Within the FSB, he was marked as a traitor and hated.
So, just like Berezovsky's press conference, Litvinenko's book sinks from view. And his story, it goes quiet. Until, that is, November 2006, when Gordon Corera hears a rumour that Alexander Litvinenko has been poisoned.
Well, I'm trying to work out whether it's potentially true that he was poisoned. And the problem is no one knows. So I'm talking to police, to MI5, and they're
what are they saying?
They don't know either.
What they do know is that Alexander Litvinenko is very ill, lying in a bed at University College Hospital in London.
I remember going down there. There's lots of journalists, lots of people asking questions.
At first, doctors think it's just food poisoning or a tummy bug. But every day, Litvinenko gets sicker, and the crowds outside the hospital grow. No one knows whether to believe the rumours that he's been poisoned until the 19th of November, 2 weeks after he went into hospital.
Good evening. Scotland Yard is investigating the poisoning of a Russian dissident living in Britain.
Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian spy, became ill earlier this month, shortly after meeting a contact in London.
His doctors say he was given a potentially lethal dose of the chemical thallium.
Now, finally, his doctors confirm he's been poisoned. The next day, a photograph is released. It shows Alexander Litvinenko sitting in a hospital bed. His hair's fallen out. He's now completely bald, a tangle of wires covering his chest. He's looking directly into the camera, a resigned look in his eyes, of a man who knows he's about to die. What do you remember thinking when you saw it?
I remember wondering what could do that to a man. Because you could see a picture of him with his hair looking young and healthy. And then you saw this person, whose hair was gone. And you're like, this is not a normal poisoning. This is not something normal.
And now there's a race against time to identify the poison, in the hope they can still save him. All doctors know is that the poison contained some kind of radiation.
Because the radiation is cooking him from the inside. It's cooking his organs and destroying his organs progressively. His body was collapsing And poor Marina, who when she first goes to him,
His
wife, she tries to stroke his hair because he's so ill, and his hair just comes out in her hand. And, having to watch that deterioration, knowing basically there's no hope for him, because I think there was never any hope for him once they realised what it was.
And doctors only find out what was making him sick on the 23rd of November, 22 days after Litvinenko became ill. They'd sent a urine sample to Britain's top-secret nuclear research site in the UK, and the results were astonishing.
The tests come back and say, yes, it's this incredibly rare substance, polonium. And the fact it's polonium is crucial because, this is not something you can buy. You can't buy this off the internet. You can't find it. You can't make it yourself. You get it from a nuclear program, which only a state has.
But by the time they identify the poison, it's too late.
Now, within the past minute or two, we've just had it confirmed that the poisoned Russian ex-spy Alexander Litvinenko has died in hospital in London. I understand...
We're sorry to announce that Alexander Litvinenko died at University College Hospital at 9:21 on the 23rd of November 2006. He was seriously ill.
I remember realising that this was something completely different from anything we'd covered before or thought that was possible. I mean, the death of Alexander Litvinenko and who was behind it and its consequences, actually it would become one of the stories that stayed with me more than almost any other.
Before he died, Alexander Litvinenko summoned the strength for a final act of resistance.
From his deathbed, he dictated a message. This morning, it was read outside the hospital, and it was aimed directly at President Putin.
Shall I read it?
Yes, please.
So this is the statement in the name of Alexander Litvinenko, but read by his friend Alex Goldfarb just after he died, standing with a kind of group of journalists, lots of cameras, lots of people just outside University College Hospital. You may succeed in silencing me, but that silence comes at a price. You have shown yourself to be as barbaric and ruthless as your most hostile critics have claimed. You have shown yourself to have no respect for life, liberty, or any civilized value. You have shown yourself to be unworthy of your office, to be unworthy of the trust of civilized men and women. You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest
from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life. May God forgive you for what you have done, not only to me, but to beloved Russia and its people.
Years later, the British government will conduct an inquiry into Litvinenko's death. They'll conclude that he was poisoned by agents acting on behalf of the Russian state, that the kill order probably came from Vladimir Putin himself, a claim the Kremlin denies. Do you think Litvinenko's allegations on the apartment bombings made him a target? How big a role did that play?
I always think with Litvinenko, it's not finding a motive for why the Russian state would have killed him, but choosing from so many, because frankly there were so many reasons why I think they wanted him dead. He is a former FSB officer who's in exile. He's someone who had a direct and personal animosity with Vladimir Putin and who was working with Boris Berezovsky, Putin's kind of arch critic. And I do think the apartment bombings were one of the more significant factors. And, a lot of people who've investigated the apartment bombings have met untimely ends.
At the end of the last episode, we said there were 2 deaths for the 2 men who'd come to London, hoping to find safety. Litvinenko died in 2006. 7 years later,
the Russian businessman Boris Berezovsky is found dead at his home in Berkshire.
Tonight, outside his home in Ascot, a heavy police presence as they launch an investigation into his death.
The body of the 67-year-old was discovered in a bathroom by an employee who had to force open the door.
Boris Berezovsky is found dead on the bathroom floor of his house with a scarf around his neck. At first, Berezovsky's death is described as suicide by hanging. But given his public feud with Putin, many wonder if there's more to it. A year later at the inquest, the coroner says he can't prove beyond reasonable doubt that Berezovsky took his own life, or that he was unlawfully killed. And that's where the inquest ends. Boris Berezovsky's death will probably always remain a mystery, much like the finer details of his life. In his obituaries in the Russian media, Berezovsky was described as a cunning master of chaos, an evil genius, a giant spider who tangled so many in his web. And journalists who met him, or who, like Jeremy Vine, went to his press conferences, were right to question his motivations. But people like Boris Berezovsky make the job of us journalists much harder. His feud with Putin was real, and he had a score to settle. So how far can you trust a man with motives as complex as his? How do you know when the truth spinner becomes a truth teller? Especially when delivering a message that feels impossible to believe. So often, the answer only comes with that precious thing that news journalists don't have when they file their copy: hindsight.
Looking back, I wonder whether this might have been a press conference where the guy was genuinely trying to get something off his chest. Gosh, these things you don't realise they're important until maybe 20 years later.
Next time on Putin and the apartment bombs. We're back in Russia, where the investigation Litvinenko began is reignited by another former FSB officer, determined to expose the truth.
I was tipped off that there was one FSB investigator, former KGB, who was still following this story and had a kind of an amazing story in his own right to tell.
And unlike Litvinenko, this FSB officer lives to tell his tale. The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown.